When we talk about personal liberties, we necessarily carry with that discourse the question of how far our right to do something actually extends. To that end, a quote that has long stuck with me is from Oliver Wendel Holmes Jr., who observed that the right to swing his fist ended where another man's nose began. The quote resurfaces in my mind from time to time, and it's been coming up a lot for me lately. Yes, there is a Second Amendment right to bear arms, but that right arguably ends before you shoot at someone for misdelivering an Instacart order or using your driveway to turn around. Yes, you have a First Amendment right to practice whatever faith you select or even no faith at all. But your right to do so stops before you foist your religious beliefs on someone else or demand their adherence to your religious tenets. As applied to the case that I picked for today, I'd suggest that the right to physically discipline your child ends before injury begins. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Before I kick off today, I'm offering a listener's note. The domestic violence victims discussed in this case were 11-year-old children. That might mean that this isn't the episode for you, and I'll catch you next time. In 2021, Staff Sergeant Quentin Brassfield and his family moved from Brassfield's duty station in Hawaii to their new duty station and home in Virginia. The Brassfield family consisted of two twin 11-year-old boys, John and Joe, those are pseudonyms that I've assigned to them, their stepmother, and young half-sister. Military moves are stressful for a variety of reasons. You don't really pick where you're moving, and unless you're moving yourself in a U-Haul, you also don't really get to pick your movers. Your stuff could end up together on one truck, spread mysteriously across one truck, or divided. You almost never get your stuff all back or back in the condition it shipped in, and you're under the gun to immediately unpack, take inventory, and file a claim in the hopes that whatever lowball offer you get for the damage done to your carefully curated possessions is enough to fix maybe one of them. R.I.P. my Pfaff sewing machine. Issues with moving and movers are pretty endemic, and the effects are financially significant. Recent surveys revealed that there's an average of just under $2,000 in unreimbursed out-of-pocket expenses during a move, and that the average military family lost an additional $3,000 in items that were lost or otherwise damaged during the move. Together, then, the average military family is out about $5,000 every time they uproot their lives, and they can't always predict when that move will happen with any kind of accuracy. It could be 3 years, but it could be just 1 or less. The next time a military spouse complains about their move, please know, their woes are justified, and recent DoD recontracting decisions will not improve the experience. After your family survives the chaos of the move, the unpacking, the mourning of lost heirlooms and memories, spouses are often on the hunt for new employment with admittedly mixed results. It's not just the loss of cash money or the items that need to be replaced, but the ensuing loss of income that can plummet a family into financial strain. It doesn't help that it's immediately time to pony up first, last, and a security deposit and purchase an entire pantry again, especially if your move was overseas or back. And if you couldn't afford to ship your car or cars or couldn't stomach white-knuckling it across the nation as quickly as possible, you might also be in the market for a new form of transportation. I offer all of that to conclude with this. The stress of moving compounds with the financial realities of uprooting your life, and none of it justifies what happened in the case that I selected for today's episode. About 6 months after the Brassfields arrived in their new home in Virginia, Mrs. Brassfield couldn't locate some undisclosed amount of money where she knew she'd left it. Brassfield asked the boys where the money went, but both denied knowing. Mrs. Brassfield switched into detective mode. It's not clear anywhere that I could find just how Mrs. Brassfield discovered where the money went, but she somehow put together that John and Joe, her young stepsons, had taken the cash. Brassfield waited until the children returned from school on January 7, 2022, and confronted them, again demanding to know where the money was. One of the young boys cracked under the pressure and confessed that they'd taken the cash. Brassfield ordered John and Joe to return to their respective bedrooms, to strip down to their underwear, and to wait for their punishment. Brassfield entered John's room first, carrying a belt folded in half over itself. He told John to face the wall, then began berating him, yelling at him for his shameful behavior and whipping John with the belt across his back, arms, and legs. John suffered at the hands of his father for what he estimated to be 3 or 4 minutes, screaming and crying out at the brutality he endured. From his room, Joe heard everything. When Brassfield determined John had been sufficiently punished, he traveled to Joe's room and discovered his other, and I cannot stress this enough, 11-year-old son, hiding under his blanket, hiding from the boogeyman that was his father. Brassfield ordered Joe to turn around. John heard Joe crying out, repeating, "No, no, no." Before Joe complied, Brassfield began whipping him in the same manner he'd beaten John. Joe eventually managed to turn over, and John could hear his screams from his own room. As Brassfield swung his belt like a switch, he hit Joe on his arm, wrist, nipple, back, and face. He terrorized his son, yelling that he should be ashamed of himself and demanding to know where the stolen cash was. Getting no answers from Joe, Brassfield returned to John's room to again ask where the money was. John confessed that they'd spent it, and Brassfield resumed his brutality. He dragged the boys together into one room and continued abusing them, demanding more details about the missing money. When his cruelty finally ended, Brassfield ordered them to stay in their rooms for the rest of the day. They could not leave to go eat dinner or to use the bathroom. The boys were so fearful of further barbarism from their father that one of them urinated in his own bedroom in order to comply with the order that he was given. He said he did it because he was afraid his father might kill him if he dared break from the narrow set of instructions. Neither Brassfield nor his wife checked on the young boys for the rest of the night. John later described this as the worst beating he ever took, implying, at least to my ear, that this was not the first time Brassfield beat him. John reported bruises and swelling on his back, legs, and arms. Joe similarly reported being in pain everywhere. He bore marks on his wrist and face, some of them bleeding. One of Joe's friends at school saw the marks Brassfield left, but it wasn't until 3 weeks later that Army CID was finally notified. I wonder how much of that delay was due to the fact that it was winter in Virginia and the boys wore layers that hid many, if not most, of their injuries. John described the belt to investigators as a thick leather army belt, tannish brown in color, reporting it was the first time Brassfield had ever hit them with a belt. An expert later testified that the injuries the twins endured were consistent with a tan army belt. The expert came to that conclusion after examining trial counsel's army belt. Following the report of child abuse that had taken place 3 weeks earlier, CID interviewed the boys and photographed their injuries. They also brought the boys back 5 days later to take follow-up photographs. An expert examined those photos and testified that she found 5 specific injuries to Joe: his left wrist, abdomen, chest cavity, outer left thigh, and back left thigh. Similarly, she identified a number of specific injuries to John: 3 on his upper arm, his upper left shoulder, mid to right back, the small of his back, 2 to his right flank, his left abdomen, and his upper left thigh. It's probably worth noting that the expert was working from photos of 3-week-old injuries and could still identify specific injuries within them. For his part, Brassfield maintained that he was targeting John's lower backside, but seemed to blame the extent of John's injuries not on his own rage, but on John, quote, jumping around. Brassfield said he didn't remember how long he whipped John, but believed that it was less than a minute. He asserted that Joe was more jumpy. He confessed he didn't really know where exactly his belt hit the boys, but he blamed other scrapes, scratches, scars, and bruises on his boys being boys who skateboarded, biked, and generally horsed around. He claimed credit for his boys being well-dressed and well-spoken at trial, explaining that his discipline put them on the right path. Brassfield elected a judge-alone court-martial, at which he was convicted for 2 specifications of domestic violence. For whatever it's worth, Brassfield was adamant that he did not hit his boys with his military-issued uniform, but rather, quote, cheap belts that came with the shorts he bought. This little tidbit of information rattled around for a while inside my head, this desire to separate his violence from his uniform, to clarify that even though he whipped his 2 minor children with a belt, it was a flimsier belt than the one Uncle Sam required him to wear and always have on hand. In my head, if you're at the point where debating what sort of belt it would be okay to whip an 11-year-old child with, you should probably consider whether a plea agreement is available to you because, presumably, you're already aware of just how badly you screwed up. But as you've likely gathered, Brassfield and I would disagree, and I'll get into that in the Legal Beagle section. The judge found that Brassfield's subjective, and I would offer misguided, intent was to promote the welfare of the twins by physically punishing them for their misconduct in lying. Nevertheless, the judge found Brassfield guilty and sentenced him to confinement for 28 days, that's 2 consecutive 14-day terms, and reduction from E6 to E1. On appeal, Brassfield first challenged whether his conviction was factually and legally sufficient, but those are old hat. We've been there and critiqued those standards. Beyond those asserted errors, the issue continued to be the question of what level of corporeal punishment of children, if any, is legally defensible. In this country, people have a right to procreate, and parents have a fundamental right to make decisions relating to the care, custody, and control of their children. The 14th Amendment, for instance, protects the rights of parents to make medical decisions on behalf of their children, but apparently it no longer protects a woman's right to make medical decisions for herself. What a weird little incongruity in the law the current Supreme Court has made. Brassfield specifically challenged whether reasonable force should be considered in the parental discipline defense. I think we can reasonably assume that Brassfield chose a judge-alone court-martial because he intended to offer a nuanced defense. He didn't argue that he didn't whip his children. From what I gather, he argued that it wasn't severe enough to rise to the level of abuse, and stayed on the legal side of parental discipline. In military courts, the use of force in punishing children is justified if the force is used for the purpose of safeguarding or promoting the welfare of the minor, including the prevention or punishment of misconduct, and the force is not designed to cause or known to create a substantial risk of causing death, serious bodily injury, disfigurement, extreme pain or mental distress, or gross degradation. Brassfield arguing that he hit his boys but that it wasn't abusive is an argument that I don't think plays well with a panel, each of whom approaches parenthood differently. And it makes sense to me that he wanted to make a very specific argument to a judge alone. The parental discipline defense relies on the idea that parents are allowed to use reasonable physical force to discipline their children. The more finders of fact there are, the more opinions there are on what constitutes reasonable force in disciplining children. Some factors that might be considered include the size differential between the two, the child's age, the number of blows inflicted, where the blows were inflicted, whether it was inflicted with an open hand or a closed fist, or some other object or weapon. A fact finder has to decide whether a reasonable person would find that the punishment was necessary and reasonable under the circumstances, and whether the government proved those facts beyond a reasonable doubt. By selecting a judge-alone court-martial, Brassfield really only had to confront what one individual found to be reasonable when it came to disciplining children. That's why Brassfield necessarily got so caught up with the type of belt he utilized in whipping his children. A thick leather belt or even a thick nylon web belt would inflict more injury, would be less reasonable, by his argument, than a softer twill or ribbon or whatever kind of belt he says came with the shorts that he bought regularly. But his argument didn't really amount to much, because the trial court judge found that the force was not reasonable. Brassfield argued on appeal that the judge applied the wrong legal standard when he made his findings, because the judge should have determined whether Brassfield used excessive force, and because the judge never defined extreme pain. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals concluded that the judge applied the correct legal standard. To the extent Brassfield truly believed that the force he used was neither excessive nor unreasonable, I'd remind everyone that he whipped his 11-year-old boys so severely that 3 and nearly 4 weeks later, the patterns of injury were still visible enough to be documented and detailed enough to identify 16 separate injuries. I know that I've already highlighted that one of the boys called this the worst beating he'd ever received, and worried that it might be indicative of other interactions. I think it's also worth observing here that these whipping injuries were worse because they were inflicted on bare skin. There were no clothes to absorb some of the velocity and violence of Brassfield's swings, because Brassfield made sure of it when he ordered the boys to undress their underwear. And as terrible as it is to realize and highlight this, I think it bears mentioning that the physical injuries were not the only injuries those boys endured. 2 young boys had to listen as their sibling, their twin, was beaten in the next room over, then spend a night alone in their rooms, tending their wounds, skipping dinner, too afraid to even leave to use the bathroom. And that during those quiet hours they spent huddled alone in their rooms, tending their wounds, neither responsible adult in the house checked on them and ensured they were okay. Although I was of course curious about the amount of cash the boy's stepmother determined was missing, it doesn't bother me that the ACCA opinion doesn't share what amount that was, because frankly, no amount of money would make this an appropriate so-called punishment. And I get to say so-called punishment because this wasn't punishment. This was abuse, as determined by the court-martial and confirmed by the ACCA. Thank you, as always, for listening. I understand that this particular topic might not motivate you to hit the share episode button, so in lieu of sharing, please rate the podcast wherever you listen. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductandbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductandbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we return to the variance case I mentioned in episode 57. Until then, take care. Conduct and Becoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct and Becoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.